So on April 18th, just 8 days ago, you may have noticed there was a super large event which shut down roads between Hopkinton and Boston, Massachusetts, a total of 26.2 miles of road, and then some for logistical purposes. If you're new to New England, competitive sports, or running, you may have never heard of the Boston Marathon. But seeing as you are all members of the Wellesley College community, you might be more familiar with the name Marmon, or simply associate the closed roads with a Monday holiday. As Paul Clarici dramatically writes in his book, Boston Marathon, History by the Mile, quote, Boston, that's it. That's all you need. If you're a runner or fan of running, that one word is all that's required to convey the pinnacle of the sport, unquote. Growing up, I heard about the Boston Marathon from relatives and always knew there was something significant about this race. In fall 2021, I myself was training for and eventually ran, with some walking mixed in, the 125th Boston Marathon. At the same time, I was a student in Dr. Eric Girard's seminar, Gods of Stone, Monuments and the Sacred, a course which equipped me to ask about the purposes of monuments, their historical value, and our need to critically evaluate them using different approaches. Taking the academic lens from this class to the Boston Marathon meant asking one big question. Is the Boston Marathon a monument? In order to answer my question, I enlisted the help of 8 participants in the 125th Boston Marathon to learn about their histories as runners and experiences with that year's Boston Marathon in particular. Andrew Hearns is a British American who has lived on the North Shore in Massachusetts for the last 11 years, and he works as a food scientist. Joe Lauer is a lecturer in the math department and assistant coach to the cross country and track and field teams at Wellesley College, where he has worked since 2017. Stephen Jilanov attended Harvard University for undergrad, where he participated in the running club, and he is now a second-year student at the Yale School of Medicine. Chelsea Bishop was a Division III athlete at Stonehill College and now works as an associate attorney at Chartwell Law. Professor Julia Miwa works in the chemistry department of Wellesley College, and her research seeks to understand how proteins aggregate during the development of Parkinson's and other neurodegenerative diseases. John Levy is a resident of Westborough, Massachusetts, and gastroenterologist at UMass Memorial Medical Center. He has lived along the Boston Marathon course throughout his life. Caroline Sullivan is a lifelong resident of Massachusetts, and she loves that she is now living and working in Boston. And finally, Caitlin Phillips, who competed in the 125th Boston Marathon amongst the pro women's field and finished in 20th place. Each of them came to running in their own way, whether tricked into joining the cross-country team in middle school or having lifelong aspirations to run ultramarathons, which are races longer than 26.2 miles. Across their differences with running, they shared very similar definitions of what a monument is. Everyone seemed to think of a monument as something you go to see, a material object that has a connection to something historical. In their eyes, it might be a physical representation of something significant or something that brings a certain historic or sentimental value. Their definitions were both classic and sensible, but needed a bit more breadth to entertain the idea that a sporting event could be a monument. Wu Hong, an art historian from the University of Chicago, uses 2 concepts to create an expansive definition: monumentality and monument. To Hong, monumentality sustains the functions of a quote-unquote monument, the physical important kind described by the folks I interviewed, even after it has lost its commemorative and instructive significance. Monumentality denotes a certain level of continuous memory with political, ethical, and religious obligations to a tradition. To consider this definition of monumentality, a way of thinking about monumental things, it seemed important to make sure everyone was talking about the same thing when we talked about the Boston Marathon. To get into this, My participants talked about the history of the race, the development of the course, famous runners, and the event's longevity. For context, the Boston Marathon began humbly with 15 men gearing up for a foot race, only to transform into its current form of nearly 30,000 participants. After 126 years, it only makes sense that various aspects of the race have changed. As for women's history, there were no official female entrants for the first 75 years. It wasn't until the 1972 Boston Marathon that women could officially run that distance. The Boston Marathon holds a special place in the hearts of all the participants with whom I spoke, largely because they have home-like connections to the city. From the perspective of an outsider, it was elite runner Caitlin Phillips who told me that running Boston is special in comparison to other major world marathons and the US Olympic trials. So what actually makes Boston qualitatively different enough to be considered monumental? Paul Corici also writes that, quote, "For so many reasons, the Boston Marathon has become the measuring stick for the sport. No other marathon outside the Olympics possesses such pull for anyone who calls themselves a marathoner, from the elite to the middle of the packers to those in the back. The Boston Marathon is on many a runner's bucket list, whether attainable or not. For a fan, the Boston Marathon is an exceptional competitive with the elites, and inspiration with the non-elites event. And for the spectator, the Boston Marathon is the ultimate communal gathering," end quote. The aspect of attainability motivates so many to run. John Levy told me that less than 8% of marathon times are considered qualifiers for Boston. If you do qualify, that puts you in the top 10% of runners. Most people do what participants Chelsea, Stephen, and Joe described to me. They qualify to run the Boston Marathon by running another marathon at a ridiculously fast pace. This is such a big deal that runners have their own verb for it, to BQ. While it is possible to be gifted a bib like Caroline or fundraise for a nonprofit like Julia, many run race after race to qualify. Aside from being blown away by the speed and dedication of folks who do BQ, what this brings to my mind is something developed by French philosopher Michel Foucault. He came up with the term heterotopia to define a cultural or institutional space which is in some way othered. For my purposes, I thought of being othered as monumental. Foucault's fifth principle for what constitutes a heterotopia reads, quote, "Heterotopias always presuppose a system of opening and closing that both isolates them and makes them penetrable. In general, the heterotopic site is not freely accessible like a public space." In terms of participation, there are few things as isolated with opportunity for penetration as the Boston Marathon. If you aren't able-bodied, a part of the para-athletic division, and or wealthy, good luck, because the elitism and inaccessibility of the race is one of the reasons it is considered so great. Author of the renowned book, The Sacred and the Profane, Mircea Eliade also gets into this as he writes about how a sacred space is detached from everything surrounding it, effectively making it qualitatively different. All 8 of the runners I interviewed believe the Boston Marathon is a big deal, with the kind of existential value that Eliade would require for a sacred space. They were particularly interested in the community and connection aspects of Boston as a race. Joe considers it his hometown race. Caroline told me that when you finally get into the Brookline area, it feels like coming home. And while 7 out of 8 of the folks I interviewed live in Massachusetts, even Caitlin, who resides in New York City, specifically remarked that the Boston Marathon has a cozy feel. These well-aligned sentiments and ideas about what the Boston Marathon is gives importance to the impressions and memories that coincide with the experience of running the race. How does this contribute to the argument that it's a monument? Well, if you spend any period of time doing something that you consider to be a big deal after months, maybe even years of preparation, you will hopefully remember it. When it came to memories of the Boston Marathon, the folks I talked to varied in what they remembered. Chelsea lost her phone before getting to the tee to get to the pre-race action in the Boston Common. Stephen got a cramp in his hamstring that was unshakable. Joe got the worst stomach pain of his life. Andrew relished in the moments after finally crossing the finish line. Each of these stories are epic and worth sharing in their own right, but they are things felt and experienced by the individual. Conversely, the course content of our seminar focused on the memories maintained by groups. The French philosopher Maurice Halbach would say we experience a collective memory, which is a way of constructing the past for the present. Cultural anthropologist Aleda Osman would remind us that a place has no memory of its own, which means the cultural memory we give it is what makes it significant. When applied to something more tangible like 26.2 miles of road, I would say that the memories and the importance we derive from them are the salient experiences and stories of the runners themselves. Out of all the important places and shared memories of the Boston Marathon, the 8 people I spoke with identified 2 standouts. The first is the scream tunnel. Many of us have experienced the epicness and volume of the scream tunnel, which gives runners the power and adrenaline rush to make it to the halfway point of the marathon, feeling like they can finish strong. The second one is perhaps a little less familiar to those in the audience today, unless you spend a great deal of time in Newton by Boston College. The naming of Heartbreak Hill is for 650 yards of incline, and the term came about in 1936 when the famous runner Johnny Kelly was racing Ellison Brown up the hill. The two seemed to be competitive for first place until then, but Kelly ended up finishing in 5th after trying to engage with Brown while going up the hill. The Boston Globe wrote about the moment as one which broke Kelly's heart, and has broken many hearts in the ensuing years. In my participants' consideration of the Scream Tunnel and Heartbreak Hill, there is a process of remembering and reconstructing at work. Even as new experiences are had by those plowing by Wellesley College or making their way down Commonwealth Avenue, Aleda Osman would note how the shifting, distortion, reevaluation, and reshaping of the memories around these 2 iconic locations remain somewhat steadfast. Those familiar with the Boston Marathon hold a collective memory about these 2 locations along the course, which give it monumental value. It's the goodness and struggle, the potential for defeat or greatness, which these athletes continuously chase. But if we assume there are unchanging, iconic qualities about the Boston Marathon, like the loudness of the Scream Tunnel and steepness of Heartbreak Hill, what happens when something significant disrupts what we assume we know? This question was answered for me by contending with the domestic terror attack in 2013 when a bomb exploded near the finish line, killing 3 people and injuring upwards of 260 others. If we believe the Boston Marathon and all that comes with it is sacred, then we have to insist that there is something opposite of that, the profane. And according to Eliane, if Boston is a sacred cosmos, any attack from without threatens to turn it into chaos. The bombing was only brought up by 2 of my interviewees. This was appropriate because I focused on their experiences from running in the 125th race specifically, but it could have come up in accounts of the marathon's history. Julia was the one who spoke the most at length about it as a friend's partner ran Boston that day. Joe told me about Olympian Meb Keflika's run up Heartbreak Hill in 2014's marathon, the one after the bombing, as people chanted USA for him. The bombing gave the marathon new history and importance. If the epic race was not something worth memorializing before the attack, now there was actually something that people needed to commit to memory. This reinforcement of the 2013 marathon's event through the creation of a physical monument in Copley Square and a project maintained by the Boston City Archives and Northeastern University furthers the idea that the Boston Marathon is a monument. For all these efforts led to the preservation of a cultural memory. In Monuments and Monumentality, the archaeologist James Osborne writes that, quote, "It is futile to ascribe an absolute meaning to any given monument. end quote. Thinking back to answers given by my participants about how they would define the word monument, it would be hard to argue that they said anything abnormal in their descriptions. In fact, they all said pretty middle-of-the-road normative definitions that describe monuments as large, permanent, public-type objects. And yet, when I asked them if they thought the Boston Marathon was a monument at the end of our conversations, they had new ideas. To them, the Boston Marathon is an event, a place, a physical thing which gathers people together and affects them emotionally. In no other world do the best of the best run alongside novices, nor do folks from Framingham think they have a great deal in common with residents of Back Bay. The Boston Marathon works as a monument because it brings different people, places, and things together with the goal of creating something distinct and, for lack of a better word, sacred. It bears its own cultural, political, and historical importance, which is continuously reinforced by those who participate in it by racing or watching year after year. The Boston Marathon is given a special kind of value as people consider it to be an elite and special experience worth cherishing. It has a collective and cultural memory which people draw from to inform themselves and add to post-race. Beyond its linear shape, robust size, public visibility, and 126-year permanence, the Boston Marathon is a monument because of the meaning it carries and relationship it has in a cultural context. Combining the work of theorists and academics like Osman, Eliade, Foucault, Hung, and Osborne with Boston Marathon-centric thinkers, it's clear that this race is something special. The Boston Marathon is an iconic global event for those who dream of fame. It's a race that redefined itself in the face of tragedy. It's the race of the people of Boston. And as my project sought to affirm, it is a monument.